All right. I slept in till 1 o'clock this afternoon. I normally get up at like 7 or 8, so that was pretty nice. Um, so today, my plan is to see how long I can go for. Um, I do have all these Bible things that I was going to do for Sunday, but since today's not Sunday, I think I'm just going to try to get through the 31st and the 1st for now. And then if I can, start on the 2nd, get myself caught up a little bit. I just need to stop watching so much YouTube during the day and just start producing. The reason I watch is habit. Um, I spent for the first, well, for quite a bit, for many years, I probably spent like 8 to 10 hours on social media every day, just commenting stupid shit and looking for stupid stuff and trying to keep up with things. But now I still watch for the same reason, but I don't watch as much. So, all right. Let's finish up the OpenStax philosophy. So, do, do. Explanation, coherence, predicates, descriptions, narration, thought experiments. Okay. All right. I'm going to reread Thought Experiments, section 1.2 of philosophy. Close. Zoom, zoom, zoom. When philosophers want to clarify the relationship between concepts, they often consider hypothetical scenarios meant to isolate one or more features of a concept and place it in the appropriate relationship with other concepts. Such hypothetical scenarios are called thought experiments. These imaginative scenarios allow us to test or compare concepts to better understand their connections and logical consequences. Philosophers have used thought experiments for as long as we have a written record of philosophical thought. For instance, Plato devised an elaborate thought experiment in The Republic, in which he depicts Socrates and several of his friends describing an ideal city. The premise of this thought experiment is that if philosophers could describe an ideal city in detail, they would be able to identify which parts of the city gives rise to justice. Aristotle, a Greek philosopher who followed Plato, arrived at the famous claim that nature abhors a vacuum by constructing a thought experiment. To argue for this conclusion, Aristotle assumes that there is such a void and then asks, how would one know the distance between 2 points in a vacuum? If there is any distance between 2 points, Aristotle reasons that distance would have to be the property of something. But by hypothesis, there is nothing between the 2 points. It is a pure void. Aristotle bases his reasoning on the idea that it is impossible for properties to exist without something that they are a property of. This argument reveals that Aristotle thinks distance is a property of matter. Accordingly, it is impossible to measure distance in a pure void. Therefore, Aristotle reasons it is not possible for a void to exist because it would occupy a distance that has no measure. Puzzles like this one can prompt fruitful philosopher reflection. What do you think about it? Thought experiments are also common in ethics as a way of testing out moral theories. A moral theory could be supported by a thought experiment if the result of applying the theory to a hypothetical case made good moral sense. On the other hand, the thought experiment might undermine the moral theory by demonstrating that when the theory is applied, it results in an absurd or immoral outcome. In any case, thought experiments can help us clarify the relationship between our concepts and theories. Trade-offs. Conceptual analysis, logic, and sources of evidence together help philosophers compose a picture of the world that helps them get a better grasp of truth. Recall that philosophers are attempting to understand how things hang together in the broadest possible sense. However, it is unlikely that any single philosophical picture of the world will turn out to be so obviously compelling that it completely satisfies all criteria of logic, evidence, and conceptual analysis. It is much more likely that there will be competing pictures, each with strong reasons for believing in it. This situation is the basis for philosophical discussions. No one picture is so obviously true that all others can be discarded. Instead, we have to evaluate each picture of the world and understand the trade offs that these pictures impose on us. We have to consider the practical and logical implications of the beliefs we hold to fully understand whether those beliefs are true and right. All right, one sec. Interesting. Had a thought. Gonna hold on to it. I'll come back to it again after I finish reading all these books. Biting the bullet. Sometimes when weighing the trade-offs of a particular view and its logical consequences, you may decide to bite the bullet. This means that you are willing to accept the negative consequences of the view because you find the view attractive for other reasons. For instance, on the topic of free will, a philosopher might be committed to the idea that past events fully determine the future. In such a case, the philosopher is willing to accept the negation or the negative implication that free will is an illusion. In ethics, some philosophers are committed to the view that morality is entirely determined by the total quantity of effects caused by an action. Such philosophers may be willing to accept things that would otherwise seem immoral, like harming an individual person, if that action results in a greater quantity of positive effects in the end. No view is going to be perfect, and it is difficult to make sense of the world in terms that we can explain and understand. Nonetheless, we must be honest about the logical and moral consequences of the views we hold. If you are ultimately willing to accept those consequences to maintain the view, then you can bite the bullet. Reflective equilibrium. Another method for assessing the logical and moral consequences of our thinking is to use judgments about particular cases to revise principles, rules, or theories about general cases. This process is going back and forth between an assessment of the coherence of the theory and judgments about practical applied cases is called reflective equilibrium. This process requires the revision of a theoretical and principled stance based on practical judgments about particular cases. Reflective equilibrium is achieved when you are able to establish some coherence between your theoretical and practical beliefs. Reflective equilibrium is a kind of coherence method. That is, reflective equilibrium justifies beliefs by assessing their logical consistency. As opposed to a traditional coherence approach, however, reflective equilibrium encourages the use of practical and applied judgments about cases as part of the set of beliefs that is logically consistent. Reflective equilibrium is an important method for introductory students to understand because students are frequently tempted to think they need to solve theoretical issues first before they consider the applications. Or they may choose a theory and then try to apply it to cases. Reflective equilibrium emphasizes that this procedure is likely neither possible nor desirable. Instead, a philosopher should be aware of both the theoretical commitments and the practical concerns of their position and use their understanding of each to inform the final analysis of their beliefs. 1.3. Socrates is a paradigmatic historical philosopher. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain Socrates' appreciation for the limits of human knowledge, identify Socrates' primary moral principles, describe Socrates' life, death, and philosophical interests, compare Socrates' moral philosophy with classical Indian philosophy. Socrates is a foundational figure for Western philosophy. Even though he did not write any works himself, his life and thoughts are captured by three different contemporary sources whose works we still have. Socrates is depicted in several of Aristophanes' comedic plays. Aristophanes, an accomplished Athenian playwright, won several dramatic competitions of his day. 11 of his 40 plays survive, and in 3 of them, The Clouds, The Frogs, and The Birds, Socrates appears as the main character. Aristophanes' depiction of Socrates is ridiculous, and Plato appears to think that this depiction is partially responsible for Socrates' ultimate trial and death. Another contemporary of Socrates, the historian Xenophon, wrote an account of Socrates' trial and death in his Memorabilia. Finally, and most important, Socrates' student and friend Plato made Socrates the central figure in nearly all of his dialogues. Plato and Aristotle are the most influential of the Athenian philosophers and have had a profound influence on the development of Western philosophy. Plato wrote exclusively in the form of dialogues, where his characters engage in discussion centered on philosophical issues. Most of what we know about Socrates is derived from Plato's depiction of him as the primary questioner in most of the dialogues. Therefore, even though Socrates did not write works of his own, his life and death remain a testament to his profound and impactful philosophical life. For that reason, it is useful for us to consider the figure of Socrates as a paradigm of the philosophical life. In particular, Socrates' defense of himself during his trial is in many ways a defense of the philosophical life. Socrates was accused by a young upstart politician named Meletus of corrupting the youth and undermining the gods of the city. These crimes were considered to be a kind of treason that undermined the legitimacy and future of Athenian democracy. The speech Socrates gave in his own defense to the Athenians, as recorded by Plato, remains a vivid and compelling defense of the sort of life he lived. In the end, his defense was not successful. He was convicted, imprisoned, and killed in 399 BCE. Plato provides account of the trial and death, not only in Apology, but also in Crito, where Socrates argues with his friend Crito that it would be unjust for him to escape from prison, and in the Phaedo, where Socrates engages in a debate with several close friends, arguing in his jail cell just before he dies that the soul is immortal. Okay. The life which is unexamined is not worth living. After Socrates is convicted and has a chance to address the jury to persuade them to offer him a sentence or punishment other than death, he considers and rejects the idea of exile. If he lived in exile, Socrates believed he would no longer be able to carry on his work as a philosopher because a foreign city would be even less welcoming of his strange questioning than his hometown. In speaking about this alternative, he says the following: Someone will say, "Yes, Socrates, but cannot you hold your tongue? And then you may go into a foreign city, and no one will interfere with you." Now, I have great difficulty in making you understand my answer to this. For if I tell you that this would be a disobedience to a divine command, and therefore I cannot hold my tongue, you will not believe that I am serious. And if I say again that the greatest good of man is daily to converse about virtue, and all that concerning which you hear me examining myself and others, and that the life which is unexamined is not worth living, that you are still less likely to believe. This idea that a life is unexamined is not worth living strikes at the heart of what Socrates tells us motivates him to live a philosophical life. The statement ought to make us pause and reflect, not only because Socrates himself demonstrates his commitment to a particular kind of life, to the point of accepting death, but also because the charge that an unexamined life is not worth living rightly seems like such a serious thing. To have lived a life that is not worth living, what could be worse? Given the stakes, we ought to wonder, what does Socrates mean by an unexamined life? Or alternatively, what would it look like to examine one's life in an appropriate way? I have an answer to that, but I won't say it yet. Examination of the self. The first form of examination that Socrates clearly advises is self-examination. At the temple to the oracle at Delphi, one of three maxims engraved in the stone is the phrase, "Know thyself." Like most oracular statements, it is not clear what is meant by this phrase. Plato suggests it may be a kind of warning to those who enter the oracle: know your position relative to the gods. Alternatively, it may be a command to understand your own nature and your own mind before you seek to understand other people or the things of the world. Based on our reading of Socrates' life and works, we can assume that he considers this saying to be a command to investigate our beliefs and knowledge, to appreciate the limits of our knowledge, and to strive to eliminate inconsistencies. After all, Socrates' method of questioning, as it is described in Plato's dialogues, is exactly such an inquiry. Socrates questions about others whether their beliefs are consistent and whether they have adequate justification for the beliefs they hold. This line of questioning suggests that Socrates holds such consistency and internal justification in high regard. We can imagine that Socrates considers an unexamined life to be one in which a person holds beliefs without justification or holds beliefs that are inconsistent with one another. We may then speculate that an unexamined life is not worth living because it is dictated by beliefs and ideas that have never been tested, justified, or accounted for. You might respond that endless questioning is boring or difficult, or you may respond that ignorance is bliss. For a philosopher, this attitude is not only undesirable, but it also approaches irrationality. It seems that whatever makes life worth living for creatures capable of rational thought, a minimum requirement is that we believe things worth believing in, hold positions we can defend, and understand why we do what we do. To do that, we need to engage in self-examination, examination of nature. Even though Socrates himself did not develop an account of nature and the cosmos like many of the pre-Socratic philosophers, we may imagine that living an examined life requires us to understand the world around us. Socrates himself was well aware of the various natural philosophical accounts that were prominent in his day. Plato frequently records Socrates quoting or citing another philosopher's account of the planets and stars, natural change, or other natural phenomena when he is questioning others. Indeed, several of the dialogues place Socrates in conversations about the nature of the soul, the nature of causality, the classification of animals and plants, and so forth, all of which could fall under the examination of nature. Why might such a process of examination be important for a life worth living? We might speculate that it is important for us to remain curious. The capacity to reason gives human beings the ability to investigate how things work, to discover truths about the world around them. Neglecting that drive to understand the world around us is like neglecting a natural skill. Methods of philosophical reflection can help us make sense of the world around us. Such investigations is characteristic of the ancient philosophers and may be considered part of a life worth living. Human wisdom is worth little or nothing. In the excerpt from Plato's Apology, Socrates investigates the oracle's strange response that he is the wisest of men. First, Socrates attempts to prove the oracle wrong by finding someone wiser than he. But after time, he comes to realize that the oracle's response was a kind of riddle. He interprets the oracle as saying that Socrates is wisest because he alone realizes that human wisdom is worth little or nothing. This realization is important for Socrates' own self-examination and provides an important lesson for philosophy students. Understanding the limits of knowledge. Perhaps one of the greatest lessons you can learn from a well-rounded college education is just how much more there is to know about the world. Even the most respected scientists, philosophers, mathematicians, and historians recognize that the scope of their expertise is extremely limited. A lifetime of study can, at best, give a person deep insight into a tiny fraction of the universe of human knowledge. Beyond that, there is a vast domain of things that no human has yet discovered or understood. Consequently, it is a good idea to practice Socrates' advice, to be aware of what you do not know and not assert to assert knowledge where you lack it. People are often resistant to taking this position because they want answers. Someone who can convince others that they know the solution to their problems or personal dilemmas can exert a great deal of power over them. But we ought to recognize the dangers of asserting knowledge where we lack it. In technical areas, a refusal to admit ignorance can result in the failure of equipment, malfunctioning of machines, and in the worst cases, injury and loss of life. In the moral and political arenas, asserting knowledge where you lack it may lead to unnecessary disagreements and polarization, or it may result in ill-considered actions that result in ethical mistakes or harm to others. Most importantly, if you are not aware when you lack knowledge, you will not seek to acquire the knowledge you lack. If you believe you already know something, you will not listen to the evidence that disproves what you believe. As a result, you miss out on learning the truth. The Socratic method. Socrates engaged in a particular method of questioning, sometimes known as the Socratic method, that was characterized by his asking questions of others rather than explaining his own beliefs. Socrates is typically hesitant to offer his own ideas about the topic under discussion. Instead, he asks the people he is questioning to supply the subject matter for their discussion. Socrates' use of this strategy may be puzzling. One explanation may be that he is following the god's command, as he says in the Apology. Another explanation is that he does not claim to have knowledge about the topic in question and is genuinely happy to learn from others. Yet another possibility is that Socrates feigns ignorance and is being insincere. Perhaps his true goal is to trap or humiliate the other person by discovering some inconsistency or obvious falsehood in what they believe. It is hard to know which of these is the most likely explanation, but we will focus for a moment on a fourth possibility, namely a pedagogic I cannot say that word. Pedagogical one. Jeez. In two different Platonic dialogues, Socrates explains what he is doing by using an analogy. He compares his method of questioning to the role taken by a midwife during childbirth. In fact, Plato tells us that Socrates' mother was a midwife and that he assumes her role in philosophical conversation. The goal of Socratic questioning, then, is to assist the person questioned in discovering the truth on their own. By asking questions and examining the claims made by another person, Socrates allows that person to go through a process of self discovery. This method provides an interesting lesson for teaching and learning. Often students believe that their role is simply to receive knowledge from the teacher. But Socrates reminds us that real learning comes from only through self-discovery, and that the role of the teacher is to be an assistant, providing the kind of critical examination and evaluation necessary to help the student discover truth on their own. The importance of doing no harm. Even though many early philosophers were concerned with understanding nature, Socrates is much more concerned with ethics, or how to live a good life. He considers the primary purpose of philosophy to make one's life better by making the philosopher a better person. Even though Socrates rarely claims to have knowledge about anything at all, the few instances where he does profess knowledge relate directly to morality. In particular, Socrates asserts a pair of moral principles that are quite controversial and may appear at first glance false. However, upon closer inspection, you may find that these principles bear some truth that is worth consideration. Socrates' harm principle. Socrates' harm principle claims the following. No one willingly chooses what is harmful to themselves. When a person does harm to others, they actually harm themselves. The first principle is sometimes stated as no one intentionally chooses evil, but for the purposes of this discussion, it will be clearer to consider the above formulation. The important thing to understand about the first principle is that Socrates believes that when people choose choose bad things, they do so out of ignorance. The reason he thinks so is that he believes all people desire what is good. For Socrates, it is intuitively true that whatever someone desires, that desire is always directed at something that appears good to them, which means a person cannot choose what is harmful for its own sake. Instead, Socrates reasons when individuals do harmful things, they believe that what they are doing will bring about some good for them. In other words, when people choose evil, they do so in the belief that it is good or will bring about something good. If in fact they are wrong, then that was the fault of ignorance, not a desire to do evil. If they had better understood the consequences of their actions, Socrates reasons they would not have chosen something harmful. The second principle derives from the fact that Socrates thinks the greatest harm that can come to anyone is for their soul or their character to become corrupted. Since a corrupted soul is the result of making the kinds of choices that produce harm, it follows out that whenever someone does something harmful, they corrupt their soul, so they harm themselves. At the end of Apology, Socrates argues that it is not possible to harm a good man because even though you might kill him, you cannot harm his character or make him do evil. Socrates seems to regard physical suffering and even death as a temporary and minor harm. Moreover, he regards the harm to one's character by living a life of ignorance or malevolence as far worse than physical death. Comparison of Socrates' harm principle with ahimsa in the Indian tradition. It may be instructive to consider the possible connection between the core concept of ahimsa in classical Indian philosophy and Socrates' harm principle as discussed above. Etymologically, the word ahimsa is in Sanskrit literally means the absence of doing harm and injury. The concept is found throughout Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist texts and likely has its origins deep in classical Indian thought. A well-thought illustration of ahimsa comes from Jainism, where the concept is taken to what most of us would consider to be extreme measures, at least in the case of Jain ascetics, observing ahimsa as one of the great vows. Such ascetic Jains must take the greatest possible care not to cause harm, intentionally or unintentionally, to any creature, including insects, plants, and microbes. At the end of their lives, a devout Jain may even fast to death. In one final renunciation of doing harm, another well known example of ahimsa can be seen the philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi, who used the concept to establish a nonviolent civil disobedience movement that some say helped speed the colonial British departure from India. Ahimsa is identified as one of the highest virtues in the Vedic tradition and is one of the loftiest teachings in Indian philosophy. The idea of ahimsa informs animal ethics, just war theory, and interpersonal relations on a metaphysical level. Ahimsa is connected with karma, the causal law that links causes to effects, even across lifetimes. This informs the belief that an individual will bear a future burden for harms committed in the present through the process of samsara, or transmigration, and rebirth of the soul. According to this religious and philosophical theory, the soul brings both its good and bad karma with it from life to life, and will either enjoy the fruits of prior good actions or suffer the consequences of bad ones. Because of the laws of karma and reincarnation, any action resulting in violence, injury, or harm has the direct consequence of chaining an individual's soul to a process of rebirth and material suffering. Insofar as a person causes injury and suffering to others, they increase the total negative effects in nature. In summary, the individual creates bad effects for themselves by acting badly. From the perspective of Indian philosophy, there is a natural connection among all beings. So, causing harm or injury to one entity is like harming a family member or even part of oneself. Additionally, because individual experience is governed by the laws of karma, harm and injury to others has the result of causing injury to oneself. However, ahimsa does not focus only on the problem of causing harm. The practice of ahimsa also calls for the practice of love and compassion toward all beings. Following the same principles of karma and samsara, acts of love, kindness, and generosity have the effect of increasing the total amount of good in the world, of recognizing that we are, in the words of Martin Luther King Jr., caught in an inescapable network of mutuality and tied in a single garment of destiny. The practice of love and compassion increases the possibility of liberation from material suffering. I just had a really interesting idea. I want to say it now just so I don't forget because this is actually really interesting. Um, with word definitions, there's a lot of word definitions that unfortunately aren't very that are vague or they're very generalized. And so a scientific meaning from the definition, I guess, from my own perspective of science, would then be just to be something that can be translated into a specific set of hands-on activities um, that lines up with theoretical um, ideas or something. Because I've noticed personally, life is dualistic. That my life has been dualistic, and that the ultimate uh, form of that dualism is the ability for me to choose. And maybe I can't choose for things to happen, but I can choose how I respond to it. And so, problem with words that are not well defined is that you can use them in many places. So, I'm wondering if that's why German was so specific with the time, manner, place for the order in which we arrange the sentences, the order of importance. I don't know, but um, yeah, sorry, I had to say something. Okay, I don't remember where I stopped reading, so I'm going to go ahead and just do second paragraph. It may be useful to consider possible comparisons between the Indian notion of ahimsa and Socrates' harm principle. Both doctrines teach that by causing harm, acting through violence, or causing suffering to others, we actually harm ourselves. They describe different mechanisms for how that harm comes to us. Which do you think sounds more likely to be true? Are there advantages or disadvantages to either view? Additionally, Socrates says that no one directly desires to cause harm or do evil. Harm is the product of ignorance. For Indian philosophers, there is a connection between harm and suffering, and ignorance as well for them. As well for them, suffering is caused by attachment to temporary things, both material and immaterial, including feelings or goals and ideas. The remedy for attachment is enlightenment, which comes from recognizing that all perceptions, feelings, and desires emerge from prior causes, and that the chain of causes continues without end. All things that are part of the chain of causes, according to Indian philosophers, are temporary. Once a person has this realization, they ought to recognize the harm that comes from attachment, from trying to hold on to any product of the unending chain of causes. The connection between ignorance and harm is quite different for each philosophy, but it may be worthwhile to consider how and why they are different. It may be also worthwhile to reflect on whether there is a connection between harm and ignorance and what it might be. 1.4 An overview of contemporary philosophy. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to identify the role of professional philosophers and academics and beyond, identify the structure, organization, and thematic goals of this textbook. Contemporary academic philosophy bears minimal resemblance to the classical traditions we have discussed in the previous sections. Philosophers today, like other academics, focus on specific areas of research expertise with the goal of producing new research that advances our philosophical understanding of specific problems or topic areas. That said, philosophical investigation is still moved by the same desire to make sense of things in the most general way possible. In this section, we will introduce you to what philosophy majors do. Additionally, we will provide a brief summary of the themes and organization of the textbook. What can you do with a philosophy major? Majoring in philosophy is a great way to complete a liberal arts degree. Philosophy will introduce you to fascinating ideas and teach you to think analytically and creatively. If you enjoy the topics of this book, you should consider a philosophy major. Becoming a philosophy teacher. To pursue a career in academic philosophy, you must major in philosophy as an undergraduate and continue your studies in the field by doing some graduate work. Community colleges and some four-year schools employ instructors with a master's degree in philosophy. However, it is very common for these jobs to be occupied by almost entirely by people with PhDs. Academic jobs, particularly in the humanities and liberal arts, are extremely competitive. Even with a PhD, it will be difficult to find a job in an academic department. That said, it is much more common to find jobs teaching than doing research, but many teaching jobs will require some research. A philosophy professor or instructor may be asked to teach on a wide variety of subjects, depending on the needs of the school. By contrast, when doing research, academic philosophers tend to focus on a very specific area with the goal of becoming an expert in that topic. Expertise is generally marked by the production of research work, such as a dissertation, book, or several research articles on the topic. Academic research jobs are typically secured with tenure, meaning that there are strong protections against unjustified firing. However, recent studies of federal data show that 73% of all academic jobs are not on the tenure track. Additionally, 40% of all academic teaching positions are occupied by part-time faculty. The distribution of tenure track, non-tenure track, and part-time employees varies greatly by institution type, with community colleges employing far more part-time instructors and far fewer tenured and tenure track instructors. Meanwhile, research universities employ more tenured and tenure track faculty and fewer part-time faculty. Alternatives to academic philosophy. Philosophy undergraduate and graduate degree majors have many options outside of teaching and research in an academic environment. There is a widespread and somewhat mistaken belief that the purpose of selecting a college major is to prepare you for a specific career. While that may be true for some technical degrees like engineering or nursing, it is generally not true for degrees in the liberal arts and sciences. Many students enter college with a desire to pursue a career in some area of business or commerce. Others plan to go on to a professional graduate school in medicine or law. While it may seem like the best career decision would be to major in business, pre-med, or pre-law, this notion is probably misguided. The original idea behind a liberal arts and sciences education was that high school graduates could study a broad range of fields in the core areas of knowledge that are foundational for our culture, society, and civilization. Areas like the natural and social sciences, literature, history, religion, and philosophy. By studying these fields, students gain insights into the key ideas, methods of investigation, questions, and discoveries that underlie modern civilization. Those insights give you a perspective on the world today that is informed by the history and learning that make today's world possible, and that perspective can have a transformative effect that goes far beyond job preparation. When philosophy majors are compared to other majors in terms of their long-term career earnings, it appears that philosophy majors do very well. While the starting salaries of philosophy majors are lower than some other majors, their mid-career salaries compare very favorably with majors in areas like finance, engineering, and math. Additionally, philosophy majors have some of the highest LSAT and GMAT scores of any major. Quite a former philosophy Quite a few former philosophy majors have gone on to become CEOs of large corporations, such as Reid Hoffman, co-founder of LinkedIn, and Carly Fiorina, CEO of Hewlett Packard. Many philosophers who have earned a graduate degree in philosophy and held positions as professors and instructors have made successful transitions to other careers, including startups, technology, business, ethics, review boards, and public philosophy. Nigel Warburton, a former philosophy professor, started the philosophy podcast Philosophy Bites. That is one of the most downloaded podcasts on academic topics. He also is an editor-in-chief of the online magazine Aeon. David Barnett, a former philosophy professor, founded the company PopSockets in 2012 after leaving academia. That company now employs over 200 people and generates hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. Additionally, there are a growing number of technology, neuroscience, and medical firms that are specifically looking to hire philosophers to help with research and ethics reviews. Marcus Arvan maintains a public directory of academic philosophers who have found work outside of academia at that website there. In short, philosophers can be found nearly everywhere doing useful work and making good money. You should not let concerns about career prospects drive you away from studying philosophy. An overview of your philosophy textbook. This textbook is organized in a way that generally reflects the broad areas of specialization in contemporary academic philosophy. Areas of specialization can be grouped into the following fields: historical traditions, metaphysics and epistemology, science, logic and mathematics, and value theory. The fields of science, logic, and mathematics include research into contemporary symbolic logic, as well as interdisciplinary work in the philosophy of mathematics and the sciences. These areas are closely related to metaphysics and epistemology. Value theory includes metaethics and the meaning of value, aesthetics, normative moral theories, and political philosophy. This textbook aims to provide a general overview of each of these areas. We give students a theoretical survey of each field in philosophy and introduce applications of these areas of study to contemporary issues of interest. Additionally, we have an explicitly multicultural focus. We emphasize that philosophy has been studied and practiced throughout the world since the beginning of recorded history. In doing so, we are attempting to confront the Eurocentric bias that has been inherent to the study of philosophy in the West and create a more inclusive curriculum. Throughout this text, we introduce you to the stunning array of philosophers and ideas from ancient Greece, Rome, and China, the classical Islamic and the late medieval European worlds, Africa, India, Japan, and Latin America. We help situate you within the different regions and time periods using timelines and other tools. Whether you go on to study philosophy or this is the only philosophy course you take, the habits of mind and techniques of philosophical thought you will learn can have a transformative effect when you allow yourself to reflect on how a certain situation connects to the whole, when you critically examine your own biases and beliefs, when you investigate the world with an open mind, informed by rational methods of investigation, you will arrive at a richer sense of who you are and what your place is in the world. That's the end of Philosophy Chapter 1.